All right, welcome y'all to the November-December topic analysis from Champion Briefs. This is for public forum, and our topic that we're analyzing today is resolved. The United States should substantially reduce its military support of Taiwan. So just like with most of these topic analyses, I'm going to start with some basic background information on the topic. I want to talk strategy, and then we're going to get into some of the stock affirmative and negative arguments that I think are likely to come up on this topic. So, starting out with some background. This topic is very much what I would describe as an evergreen topic. The relationship between the United States and Taiwan is something that's been discussed in debate rounds going back 20, 30, 40 years. And especially over the last 4 or 5 years, discussions of Taiwan on other topics, especially those relating to international relations or the United States relationship with China, have been very, very common. But despite the topic being very evergreen and kind of always being around, it's also something that's constantly shifting. And that's why I think this topic is a very good one for November, December, because there's going to be a wide range of background information that debaters can pick from. But we're also right in the midst of an election year in the United States, which could seriously change the dynamics of the US and the Taiwanese relationship. And we've just approved military support. So we have a very clear model for what the United States support of Taiwan actually looks like. And so let's talk about that. What is the resolution talking about when it says that we should reduce our military support of Taiwan? The United States military support of Taiwan generally looks like two things. The most common method of support historically has been through arms sales, that is, private companies selling weapons to the Taiwanese military. And while those sales are being done through private entities, they're actually being approved by the United States federal government. So the government still has kind of oversight over those sales. If they did not want to support Taiwan, they could stop the sales. And so the fact that arms sales have happened historically is a sort of military support for Taiwan. But more recently, the United States has shifted to a model of directly providing Taiwan's military with weaponry, supplies, education, training, assets from the Department of Defense themselves. And that means that just like we do with Ukraine, the United States goes into their stockpiles and provides Taiwan with weaponry, sometimes old weaponry that maybe we're going to replace, but a lot of times brand new weaponry, um, vehicles, aircraft, tanks, carriers, these sort of things, in addition to running workshops, providing education and intelligence sharing to Taiwan. Um, any kind of connection between the United States government and the Taiwanese military is a form of support because the Taiwanese military is much less sort of dominant than the United States military. And so we see those two methods of support, and historically we've been responsible for billions upon billions of dollars of the support going to Taiwan. Arms sales from the 1990s into the present day have been in the tens of billions of dollars. And just a couple of weeks ago, the Biden administration approved $500 million of aid directly from the military to go to Taiwan. Okay, that's really the only definitional thing we need to think about with this topic, the type of support we provide. And I think that this is good for both the affirmative and negative because that support takes a wide range of forms, which means that we can make more specific arguments than we otherwise could have. For those of you who are just coming off of debating the surveillance topic, where you might have made an argument focused on a very specific type of surveillance, this is the same principle where we can focus our arguments purely on arms sales or purely on intelligence sharing with Taiwan if we feel that that's going to lead to the greatest impact or the most plausible impact for our side. So that's the first question. The second thing we need to answer then for the background is why we provide the support to Taiwan in the first place. And to understand that, we have to turn to history. Taiwan is officially known in their country as the Republic of China. And if that rings a bell, it's because China is commonly known as the People's Republic of China. In the 1940s, the Chinese Civil War began, which led to sort of communist forces in mainland China ousting the existing government, who essentially fled slash were exiled to the island of Taiwan. And so the Taiwanese government is sort of a continuation of this historic government of China, while the People's Republic of China is the side that won the civil war that took place in sort of the 1940s to 50s on mainland China. And because of that, both sides of that historic conflict assert that they have a claim to the other side. So the People's Republic of China has never formally recognized Taiwan in any capacity. They are committed to what they call the One China principle, that mainland China and Taiwan are the same entity. They have been temporarily severed, but that they're going to come back together at some point in the future as one China. And because of that, they are very hostile to countries that issue formal recognition to Taiwan. Any country that does that and were to say, we recognize Taiwan as a standalone country, would risk being cut off from China completely, losing access to their economy, losing access to any kind of relationship they have. And so because of that, most countries do not formally recognize Taiwan or engage in sort of specific diplomatic relations with them. And that extends to the United States as well. The United States maintains a policy called strategic ambiguity, where the government does not issue a clear statement saying, we believe that Taiwan is the right side of this dispute. And we do that so that we can maintain a strong working relationship with both China and Taiwan. And that's been done to great effect, right? The United States and the Chinese economy are heavily intertwined. We import quite a bit from China, they import quite a bit from us. But at the same time, we have a strong relationship with Taiwan through informal diplomatic channels. We engage in trade with them, we provide them military support, but none of this is necessarily officially recognized by the government. For example, a US president would never visit Taiwan. Doing that would send a clear message that we side with Taiwan, which risks angering the Chinese, so a president's not going to do that. Now, as for the Taiwanese side of the conflict, they claim, again, a historic right to mainland China, and essentially that they will one day be together under the Taiwanese government. Compared to China, the Taiwanese government has developed very quickly since the 1990s into becoming a more westernized form of democracy. Most rankings for government transparency, corruption, and human rights are all going to place Taiwan near the top or their highest benchmark. They have a strong democracy. They hold regular elections. They have multiple political parties. They have anti-corruption laws, all of these things that we sort of expect a Western democracy to have. And so because of that, most Western countries engage with Taiwan just in that informal capacity. So let's get into the strategic importance of Taiwan for the United States before we jump into these arguments. Outside of the obvious benefits of sort of having connections with countries, there's a few reasons why Taiwan is strategically important to the United States specifically. The first is geography. Taiwan is located off the coast of China, and it acts essentially as an anchor. So it can connect a network of US allies that almost surround China. We have Korea, Japan, the Philippines, Thailand. If you go further east, Guam and Australia, and all of these sort of island countries that we consider ourselves allies with are anchored by Taiwan as sort of a connecting point between these. The second reason they're important is economics. Taiwan is responsible for a very specific type of machine, a semiconductor, which is crucial to the creation of modern electronics. And Taiwan is responsible for somewhere between 60 and 70% of all semiconductor production in the entire world. Second most country is China, with only 7%. Because semiconductors are so important to global production, You need them to make vehicles run, make the machines that make machines. You need them for really anything electronic. Taiwan is incredibly important to the economies of most countries. If that semiconductor production were to be disrupted, that could have serious economic ramifications and cause a ripple effect into a wide range of industries. And so the United States views Taiwan as both strategically important because of its geography, its location as a place to hedge against China, but also because of its economy and the way it's established its semiconductor industry in the rest of the world. Okay. With that, let's talk about what I think some of these main arguments are going to be. So, on the affirmative, I think that most arguments are going to circle around one of three things: escalation with China, the ability of Taiwan to properly defend itself, and political trade offs. So, if we look at Chinese escalation, this is a pretty simple link chain that has connections to a wide range of impact scenarios. The basic argument here is that if the United States continues giving military support to Taiwan, that signals to China that we want a permanent presence off their border. Now, if China feels that way, if they start to feel threatened by this military support, then that increases the likelihood of miscommunication or escalations. The counter to this, obviously, is reducing aid. If we were to reduce aid, it signals to China that we don't want conflict, causing them to stand down. Now, it's going to be really important for teams to explain why military support is the trigger for a Chinese invasion, and explain why China wouldn't just take advantage of a defenseless Taiwan to invade. And I think the reason for that comes down to ideology. Inside of China, it's very effective to have Taiwan reunification as a goal. It's very effective for the government to say, look at this, we want to reunify with Taiwan someday, and we're going to do that. We have to work towards that. It's much less effective to actually engage in that conflict, because even if you could quickly crush Taiwan, that's still going to result in a political cost, right? It's going to lead to military casualties. It's going to lead to expenditures, fear within the country, all things that pose liabilities to the Chinese government. And so it's much stronger for Taiwan, or much stronger for China, to say, look at Taiwan as a goal rather than actually conduct an invasion. And then we have to say that military support is sort of the vector that pushes this over the edge, that China can stand Taiwan sort of being there, right, as a goal, but what it can't stand is Taiwan entering the fold of the United States. And this connects to a wide range of impacts. There are obviously the war impacts, nuclear escalation, death, those very standard impacts that you see. But there's also room for impacts here about the economic devastation that comes from Chinese control of semiconductors, either through a malfunctioning semiconductor industry or through a Chinese monopoly over semiconductors that could potentially pose a national security risk to the United States, for example. The other two arguments here do not have as lengthy a link chain. The first has to do with Taiwanese self-defense. The basic idea here is that the more military support we provide to Taiwan, the less likely they are to become self-sufficient. For example, Taiwan does not have a domestic weapons manufacturing industry. They do not have significant military training on their own. They're very reliant on the United States for these things. If we reduce our support, that forces them to become self-sufficient and start acting in closer to the United States model of military training, and less of we're just going to use the United States resources. And then we can say that that's important because it helps Taiwan deter an invasion on their own rather than relying on another country. Third argument has to do with trade-offs. The basic idea here is simple. Military aid to Taiwan trades off with other military and humanitarian aid. The most obvious target here for a trade-off is Ukraine. And we would say that Ukraine is in an active conflict, so they're probably more in need of support from the United States than Taiwan is, because Taiwan is not actively in battle with China. And so we potentially risk Ukraine This is especially timely now that Russia has turned to allowing North Korean troops to enter and fight Ukraine, um, because it shows that Russia is making a push that we want to help Ukraine hold the line against. So, three arguments on the affirmative: Chinese escalation, Taiwanese self-defense, and trade-offs. Let's talk about the negative. The negative has arguments that are very similar, but the internal links are going to be different. For example, we can make an escalation with China argument on the negative that is almost identical, except that we say that our military support is the only thing preventing a Chinese invasion right now. There are a lot of signals from the Chinese government saying that they plan on invading in the near future. The Chinese government has issued statements saying we want the military to be ready for invasion by 2027. They have made bold statements against the United States and against Taiwan specifically, all of which signals that they have the want to invade. But it's likely that military support for Taiwan prevents an invasion because it means that because China does not want to risk entering a war against the United States. If we pull out, that signals that we won't defend Taiwan, and that gives China a chance to strike. All of the impacts here are the same as on the F, right? Potential escalation into a regional arms race, into nuclear war, or the ramifications from the loss of semiconductors. And I think that on the negative, semiconductors are going to be really, really key. China actively wants to control the semiconductor industry because with semiconductors, no country could say no to China's demands because they could not risk cutting off the supply of semiconductors. And so if they invade the island of Taiwan, there's a couple different ways that that could cause damage or devastation to the semiconductor industry. The first is through the actual destruction of semiconductor factories. That could happen by China just over the course of war, but there's also evidence that the semiconductor companies have kill switches where they could shut off semiconductors and destroy the machines. And there's also evidence that the United States has contingency plans to destroy semiconductor factories to prevent China from getting control of them. That's obviously a serious disruption because the world can't rebuild 68% of its manufacturing capacity overnight. The other way this could disrupt semiconductor industry is by bringing it into the Chinese fold. If you think about the security risks that people talk about with Huawei developed phones or with TikTok, right? Imagine that, but in every single electronic device in the United States, that could be a significant national security risk. Two other arguments on the negative here. Intelligence sharing. The United States engages in a lot of back and forth intelligence sharing with Taiwan. Taiwan is strategically close to China, right? They are very proximate to the Chinese mainland. And so they're privy to a lot of intelligence that the United States would not necessarily have otherwise. Specifically, Taiwanese intelligence supports the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance, which is a major intelligence sharing operation between the United States and several other Western countries. If we lose that, it means that we're in the dark about what China is up to, which means any kind of miscommunication with China could very quickly lead to escalation. If you don't have intelligence, if you don't know that your opponent is doing a training exercise, for example, then you're going to miscalculate, right? Because you don't know all the variables. So intelligence is incredibly important to preventing that sort of miscalculation. Last negative argument here is about China's relationship with allies. Taiwan is viewed by most countries as a sort of democratic alternative to China in the region. You're either going to align yourself with China or you're going to kind of align yourself with Taiwan. But if we reduce our support, then that signals to our allies that we're no longer trustworthy, that we no longer are going to support democratic regimes, especially those that stand up to authoritarianism. At that point, two things could happen. The first is that countries that are sort of torn between the US and China right now move towards China, which leads to democratic backsliding. We could see this happening in countries like Saudi Arabia, but also countries in Africa. Countries like India and Pakistan may move even closer to China if they see that the United States is not going to support them. The second thing that could happen, though, is it could trigger a regional arms race. What happens if South Korea and Japan and the Philippines all see that the United States isn't going to support the South China Sea and support Taiwan? They likely think, well, we're going to be next, and they start stockpiling weaponry in response. They start developing nuclear weapons. And if one country is going to do that, the rest have to follow. And so that leads to an arms race, which increases the chance of miscalculation because these countries become situated so that their finger is essentially on the trigger. Okay, and that's very bad. So looking back over, I think that there are a lot of good arguments on this topic, but most of them are going to circle around whether or not military support causes or prevents escalation with China. I think that once teams establish that, it's up to y'all to come up with impact scenarios and find one that sort of meshes with your personal debating style, the way that you persuade. For ideas, obviously, you should check out the champion briefs. We've got dozens of arguments with different impact ideas and starter evidence there for you. But there are lots of options. Talk to your coaches, talk to your teammates, and you'll be able to come up with something great. With that, I'm going to end the lecture, and I wish y'all luck debating in November and December.